All right, we're joined now by Gabe Shipton, who's a filmmaker and also the brother of Julian Assange. Gabe, welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good to be with you again.
And so you're an Australian, but you're here in Washington D.C., kind of drumming up support for your brother in the wake of his most recent hearing, which we talked about last week on the program. We had Chip Gibbons on. People can go back and watch that interview if they want to. You saw him at the hearing, I gather.
Yes.
So how was the hearing from your perspective? This two-day affair, this kind of final battle before the decision on extradition.
Yeah, look, my impression was that the High Court judges were really feeling the pressure. They were on their best behaviour and trying to really engage with the arguments in a different way that I hadn't seen before when Julian, faces these British judges. Usually they're very closed and very terse towards the defence, but this time they were engaging with the arguments and also engaging with the prosecution arguments, making statements like, oh, so if Julian is extradited, does that mean any journalist in the UK could be extradited? And the prosecution essentially had to answer yes. So, the judges making these sorts of points I found quite interesting in a different vibe sense.
Yeah, that's huge. And I'm curious, Ryan mentioned you're here to drum up support for Julian's cause in D.C. When you talk to maybe skeptical lawmakers or staffers, you're really putting a human face on this issue, but also what are the arguments you find that have, over the course of the last almost, years and years, that have been most persuasive? I mean, you just mentioned the judge and the journalism question. That's a pretty persuasive one, especially to us journalists. But if you're talking to skeptics, and as you're talking maybe even the next week to some skeptics, what's the most powerful argument you found?
Well, it sort of changes. Everyone sort of comes at this from their own, political perspective. And, on the Democrat side, press freedom resonates a lot with people, particularly exposing war crimes, of the military-industrial complex, state criminality. Those sorts of arguments really resonate, with the Democrat side. And then, with the Republicans, it's always First Amendment, freedom of speech, First Amendment rights. And that argument carries a lot of weight, particularly with people like Rand Paul, the libertarian-leaning folks on the Hill. But there is a resolution now, Resolution 934, before in the Judiciary Committee, and we're asking lawmakers to sign on to that resolution. It's got co-sponsors like Jim McGovern, Thomas Massey, and I think there are about eight in total, and we'd like to get that to 20. So that's my real aim while I'm here in Washington.
Fantastic.
The 2016 reporting that Julian Assange did has nothing to do with these charges. Like, this is all Chelsea Manning related stuff about the cables, collateral murder. Yet Democrats still hold a huge grudge against your brother for the reporting he did on the DNC and on Hillary Clinton in 2016. How often does that still come up now, like 7-8 years later, when you're talking to Democrats? Does it go unspoken? Do you address it? Like, how do you confront that kind of political obstacle?
Yeah, that's a big one for Democrats, and we always we're always talking about what's actually at stake and sort of reframing it in that sense, saying that this is a unprecedented Espionage Act prosecution that could be turned against Democrat media in the future, like the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Do they acknowledge that it's Democratic media when you make that point?
I mean, I think it's pretty.
I think they get it.
Yeah. I think that it's pretty. That they're sort of cultural
allies.
Yeah. So I don't think anyone really denies that that's the case.
Yeah.
And having the New York Times actually writing to President Biden, which they did, I think at the end of 22, calling on him to drop the charges, that really helps focus that argument. Because having them saying, hey, look, this is a threat to us.
Right.
When we're approaching lawmakers, we say, well, if there's a Trump administration down the track, do you want them to have this precedent, to potentially use against these other media organisations? So I think sort of moving around that 2016 argument and really getting to, what's really at stake here and what this prosecution means for other media around the place, I think. And also one other argument that cuts through is that the global support now for Julian, particularly with Australia, that is one of the US's closest allies, has making this prosecution very obviously scandalous around the world, and really talking to lawmakers here about that, how it's seen by allies or even not allies like China or Russia, who use it often,
right?
Yes.
When they're confronted with their human rights
They can
abuses.
do anything they want then with the press and just point to, well, you guys are trying to lock up Julian Assange.
Yeah, exactly. So
you are locking him up.
Yeah, and so it reduces the US's standing when they want to advocate for human rights causes with these countries, but also with their allies now, such as Australia. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Australian Parliament put through a resolution that passed the Parliament. Over 2/3 of the Parliament voted for it in favour of it, and that was calling on the United States to let Julian go home. So I think these steps are really significant, speaking with lawmakers, because there's not really an understanding of how this affects the image internationally of the United States.
And actually, again, on the human level, your family has been very clear that you're worried about your brother's health and that his very life is on the line in these legal proceedings. The other thing I wanted to add to that, I wanted to ask you, any updates on Julian's health since the hearing, how he's doing, but also just how worried are you about a second Trump administration, given that during the first Trump administration, I think it was Michael Isikoff reported in Yahoo that Mike Pompeo contemplated an assassination plot against your brother. That has to be surreal, but where's your head when you think about how this could, where this could go in the coming years?
Yeah, well, if Mike Pompeo sort of ends up in this in a potentially new administration, I think that's really worrying, not just for Julian, but for many, many people. And yeah, those were very difficult times for Julian when, Pompeo called WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence agency. They were able to use clandestine operations without congressional oversight against Julian and against WikiLeaks, and that's where we saw those plots to kidnap Julian and to even kill him. And that's where this prosecution has come from. I think people need to understand that Pompeo was talking to the Justice Department, and they said, well, what are you going to do with him once you kidnap him? You can't just put him in a black site. Just wait and we'll get some charges ready, and then you can take him from the embassy. So we can see the prosecution actually stemmed from this, Pompeo going off the deep end and pursuing WikiLeaks. So it's really politically motivated, and I think that's a really good argument for the Biden administration to bring this to a close, because it was a Pompeo-fueled prosecution.
There's been reporting in Australia that there was some hope over the last several months of some type of a deal, because he is an Australian citizen. And what business is it of the United States? It's like Pakistan, like extraditing me to Pakistan for violating Pakistan's media laws.
Don't give them ideas.
I think it is a real problem going forward for journalists who write on things around the world. Carolyn Kennedy, who's our ambassador to Australia, and who met with a bunch of Australian officials, and there was some hope that there could be some deal that would come out of that, where Australia would say, look, this is not your problem, this is our problem, he's our citizen, let us handle this. Yet they seem to be pushing ahead with this attempt to extradite him here. What's your understanding of the latest in those talks between Australia, this real essential ally of the United States, and the US?
We're always pushing the Australian government to do more, and I think that's why this resolution that was passed through Parliament is important, because now the Prime Minister and the diplomats have the backing, not just the Australian people, who 90% want Julian to come home, but also the Australian Parliament. That's every single minister, Defence Minister, Home Affairs Minister, all the ministry, cabinet, have all voted to bring Julian home. So I think that's a real escalation, if you will, or like a next step for the Australian government to push their allies, the US and the UK, to bring this to an end. In terms of, these rumoured deals, I think, I'm not sure what a deal would Julian plead guilty to journalism? I think is that a potential deal or outcome that the Department of Justice would be happy with. I'm not sure, but I think any sort of deal, Julian. We know that if Julian comes here, that he could potentially face a death penalty. That was part of in the proceedings. The judge asked the prosecution, could you rule out death penalty if Julian's extradited? And he could say no, and he couldn't say yes.
Why not? What's the capital crime? Espionage?
Yeah. So under the Espionage Act, there's
Rosenberg's
room for the death penalty. So there's potential for it to be expanded. And you had the Schulte sentencing just recently, where they have an all-of-life sentence, so no parole, and bringing that under the terrorism, under the Patriot Act. So there is potential for it to expand, for other charges to be brought against Julian for other publications, like the Vault 7, 2017 CIA leaks. So that's a real concern, and any sort of deal would we would say Julian cannot travel to the US.
So now, before even going to the U.S., there is still at least one other appeals process, depending on how this hearing goes. Could you talk to us, Gabe, just a little bit about what the options might be going forward to prevent the extradition after the hearing?
Well, so Julian has, so the judges are now taken leave to make their decision on whether they'll approve an appeal or reject an appeal. If that appeal is rejected, Britain could move to extradite Julian quickly. They will order the extradition, but Julian could apply to the European Court of Human Rights to have an emergency stop on that extradition and then put a case to the European courts. But that is, you still have to make an application, that still has to be approved. And I think there were 63 applications in the previous year for this sort of thing, and only one was approved by the European Court. So that is not a guarantee that it will stop his extradition. But interestingly, the European courts heard Agnes Callamand from Amnesty International say, they had a briefing on the Hill on Monday, and she said the European courts were able to order Russia, after Navalny was poisoned with Novichok, they were able to order Russia to return him to Germany for treatment. So that's the sort of power the European courts have, and I don't think the United States would want the European courts interfering and ordering the UK to return Julian to Australia. I think that would be extremely embarrassing for the Department of Justice.
One of the key questions in the appeals was whether or not Assange would be tortured by being placed in kind of solitary confinement here in the United States. And the U.S. had made, after they realized that was a problem for them in their case, they made some representations that they said, well, we won't do that. Those representations included a clause that said, unless we decide that we need to do that. So what was the reaction from the judges to how the U.S. would treat Assange if he was extradited, and how important is that at this point in the decision making?
So those weren't really gone into a great deal in the court, and didn't form a big part of those assurances, or so-called assurances that are caveated. Didn't form a large part of the hearing. It was really more about the political nature of the charges against Julian. There's a clause in the treaty with the United Kingdom and the US that says you cannot be extradited for political charges, and espionage is inherently political. So there was a lot about that, but the prison conditions that Julian would face didn't really come up. It was more those expanding of the charges and potential death penalty sentencing that were brought up in that hearing.
Did you think the judges were kind of covering what would be a future negative ruling? Like, being more open and being more reasonable people, so that when they finally extradite him, they'll seem like more reasonable people? Or was your gut telling you that maybe the pressure was actually getting to them and they might actually kind of do the right thing?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of it is having that external, that external facing engagement and looking to be engaged. I think that is a very big part of it. I think you're right. And the pressure and the monitoring has led them to have to do that. Previously they didn't have to because, we didn't have, Amnesty International was there. We had people from the UN observing, as well as the German embassy, Australian embassy. A lot of eyes were on that court, more so than in previous hearings. So, there is that element to it as well, that they were just, entering into this sort of performance to make it seem like that they were really going to consider it and consider it properly. But we'll see down the track when they make their decision. The defence has until the 3rd of March to give more information, and then they can make their decision any time after that. So we'll see what appeal points they may allow, or whether they reject then.
Last question on my end is just, what can average people do to help? Lawmakers obviously play a big role in this. The court is, his fate is in the hands of a court right now. But if average people want to lend their support to the cause, help the cause, what can they do, Gabe?
We've been asking people to contact their representatives about this resolution 934 and ask them to sign on to that resolution, ask their representatives to sign on to that. You can also go to assangedefence.org, join our subscriber list, and you'll receive emails about what's going on around the country, different actions that you can take, donations, things like that. So assangedefence.org is a good place to go for that sort of info.
Excellent. Sounds good.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, and best of luck as you make your case to lawmakers in the next week or so.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Gabe.
Cheers.
So again, that was assangedefence.org. Go check that out. Join their mailing list, and tell your member of Congress, sign 934. That's right. It's the resolution.
That's the one.
934. Put some pressure on the Biden administration for the once in their lives, do the right thing.
That does it for us on today's edition of Counterpoints, though. Ryan will have had almost 2 weeks by next week's show to reacclimate to the non-fish universe. So Ryan will be back here next week, and maybe you'll be a little less out of sorts.
We'll see. We'll see.
There's no way to be sure.
But we'll see you then either way.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.